Hi everyone, my name is Rafi Islam and I will be talking to you about how air is turned into something that we need to operate. We breathe it in through our mouth and nose and the magic happens in the lungs. So to understand exactly how gas exchange happens, we must understand that gases diffuse down a concentration gradient and gases move from a high pressure to a low pressure. What is pressure? Pressure is the force exerted by gas molecules on the surface that they contact. This is reflected by atmospheric pressure, which is essentially our baseline of comparison. Atmospheric pressure is composed of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and other gaseous molecules. And at sea level, it is 760 millimeters of mercury. This is known as total atmospheric pressure, and this changes as you go up in altitude or as you go below sea level. Partial pressure is also another important concept of this because partial pressure is what one compound exerts to the overall total pressure. So to understand gas exchange laws, we have to understand two laws. Dalton's law describes the behavior of non-reactive gases in a gaseous mixture. It says that a specific type of mixture exerts its own pressure. Therefore, the total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is the sum of the partial pressures of the gaseous mixtures. Essentially, it helps predict the movement of gas, and thereby it says that gas will move from a region of higher partial pressure to a region of lower partial pressure because gases equalize their pressure in two regions that are connected. And the greater the difference in partial pressure, the more rapid the air will move. Secondly, Henry's law describes the behavior of gases upon contact with liquid. It says that the concentration of gas in a liquid is directly proportional to the solubility and partial pressure of that gas. The greater the partial pressure of the gas, the greater the number of gas molecules that will dissolve into the liquid. So the specific solubility of that gas in the specific liquid will dictate the concentration of gas possible in the liquid. This is due to the natural equilibrium that is maintained between gas molecules in the air and those dissolved in the liquid. So how does gas exchange in the alveoli increase oxygen in the alveoli and decrease carbon dioxide? Well, there's a difference in composition of atmospheric air and the air in the alveoli in the lungs. There are some facts that alveolar air is greater in concentration than the concentration of water vapor, which is greater than atmospheric air, and the alveolar air is more in concentration than carbon dioxide, which is more in concentration than atmospheric air. Additionally, alveolar air is less in concentration of oxygen than is atmospheric air. So because there is a greater concentration of oxygen in the atmospheric air, the oxygen moves from the region of higher partial pressure to a region of lower partial pressure of oxygen, being the alveolar air. So gas exchange in the alveoli removes oxygen from the atmospheric and replaces it with carbon dioxide. This diffusion occurs in the lungs, where oxygen is picked up by blood and carbon dioxide is released at the respiratory membrane of alveoli, and then at tissues where oxygen is released from the blood into the tissue and there carbon dioxide is picked up. So the previous processes are broken down into external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration is oxygen diffusing across the respiratory membrane from the alveolus to the capillary, whereas carbon dioxide diffuses out of the capillary into the alveolus. Pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood into the lungs from the heart, where it eventually branches into a capillary network called pulmonary capillaries. This is the location of gas exchange with the external environment, meaning that the air that you breathe in is exchanged here for carbon dioxide. In the alveoli, the oxygen is picked up by the red blood cells and binds to hemoglobin, which is a protein. Then oxygenated hemoglobin returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins, and it releases carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide diffuses in the opposite direction of oxygen. The rate of gas exchange is proportional to the partial pressure differences in oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood and pulmonary capillaries. This depends on the relative solubility of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So oxygen has a partial pressure of 104 millimeters of mercury in the alveoli, and the partial pressure in blood of the capillary is 40 millimeters of mercury. There is a difference of 64 millimeters of mercury, so the strong pressure gradient causes oxygen to rapidly cross the respiratory membrane from the alveoli into the blood. On the other hand, of carbon dioxide diffusion, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood of the capillaries is 45 millimeters of mercury, whereas the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury. So due to the solubility of CO2 or carbon dioxide being much greater than of oxygen, which is 20 times more than carbon dioxide, the concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse across the respiratory membrane in a similar manner. Internal respiration is when oxygen diffuses out of the capillaries into the cells, whereas carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells and into the capillaries. This occurs at the level of the body tissues, where it occurs via a process known as simple diffusion. It follows a partial pressure gradient, but are opposite of those present at the respiratory membrane. The partial pressure of oxygen in tissues is around 40 millimeters of mercury, and this is due to oxygen being continuously used for cellular respiration. The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is around 100 millimeters of mercury. This creates a pressure gradient that causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin, and it diffuses out of the blood and crosses the interstitial space and enters the tissue. So oftentimes it's the skeletal tissue, so we can carry out functions like contracting our bicep or extending our tricep. A little bit more about hemoglobin is that it's bound to oxygen, and that's what gives it its burgundy color. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher in tissues and lower in blood. This forces the carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the tissue, cross the interstitial fluid, enter the blood, and go to the lungs. This process does not require energy, whereas external respiration does require energy. So now we can look at the real-life example of this, being the hyperbaric chamber. A hyperbaric chamber is a unit that can be sealed and exposes a patient to either 100% oxygen with increased pressure or a mixture of gases that include a higher concentration of oxygen than normal atmospheric air. Due to the increased atmospheric pressure, a greater amount of oxygen is diffused into the bloodstream of that patient, and these chambers can be used for graft healing, anaerobic bacterial infections, and carbon monoxide poisoning. The way that this works for carbon monoxide poisoning is that there is an increased pressure in oxygen concentration, which displaces the carbon monoxide from the hemoglobin, because carbon dioxide attaches to hemoglobin more than oxygen. In other words, carbon monoxide has a greater affinity to attach to hemoglobin, which proves to be lethal, than does oxygen. So if you just overflow it with oxygen, then it will bind to hemoglobin more rapidly than will carbon monoxide. So now we can focus on the structure of hemoglobin. One red blood cell contains 720 million hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is composed of 4 proteins called globin, and each of these carry a red pigment called heme. Heme contains an ion of iron that can bind to one oxygen molecule. The function of hemoglobin is that it picks up one molecule of oxygen, and oxygen binds to iron, forming oxyhemoglobin. This then travels to the body's tissues where it is used and releases oxygen and becomes deoxyhemoglobin. So oftentimes you'll see, like, if you've ever stained your shirt with your blood or anything, it turns dark red, and that's because it releases oxygen and it turns dark red. Oxygen release is dependent on the need for oxygen in the surrounding tissue. In capillaries, the carbon dioxide enters the bloodstream, and some carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin, while the rest of it travels in the form of bicarbonate. Hemoglobin carries carbon dioxide from the capillaries back to the lungs, where it is exchanged for oxygen. The changes in the levels of red blood cells can significantly affect the body's ability to effectively deliver oxygen to tissues. This relates us to anemia, which is caused by insufficient or abnormal levels of red blood cells or hemoglobin. The kidneys secrete a hormone called erythropoietin, EPO, and it stimulates increased erythrocyte production to restore oxygen levels. Now we can look at oxygen transportation in the blood. Oxygen is not a very soluble substance in liquids, and around 1.5% of the transported oxygen dissolves in the blood. It travels in the bloodstream via plasma. Red blood cells are the body's transportation system, in which a majority of oxygen molecules are carried from the lung to the body's tissues. It's dependent on hemoglobin's ability to bind to oxygen molecules, which then bind to our red blood cells. Oxyhemoglobin is formed by oxygen binding to hemoglobin and then diffusing into red blood cells. So heme binding to and dissociating from oxygen is an important concept. The binding of the first oxygen molecule causes conformational changes in hemoglobin, and it allows for the second molecule to bind more easily. The same is true for the release of oxygen, where when the first molecule is released, the second molecules will be released even faster. When all of the 4 heme sites are occupied, hemoglobin is known as saturated, and around 1 to 3 sites are occupied, hemoglobin is partially saturated. A healthy range of hemoglobin saturation is 95 to 99 pressure. Another important concept in this is partial pressure. It facilitates the binding of oxygen to and dissociation from heme. The oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is a graph that represents the relationship of partial pressure to the binding of oxygen to heme and its subsequent dissociation from heme. As partial pressure of oxygen increases, a greater number of oxygen molecules are bound by heme, and the opposite is true. The factors that affect oxygen hemoglobin saturation and dissociation is, again, partial pressure. The automatic control mechanism regulates how much oxygen is delivered to different tissues throughout the body. This is important because certain tissues have a different metabolic rate than others. So, for example, muscles are a highly active muscle that rapidly use oxygen to produce ATP, and it lowers the partial pressure of oxygen. Temperature is also important because high temperatures promote hemoglobin and oxygen dissociation, and low temperatures inhibit dissociation of oxygen and hemoglobin. pH is also important because the lower and more acidic blood pH is, it promotes oxygen dissociation from hemoglobin, which is respiratory acidosis, and the opposite of higher pH, making it more basic, it inhibits oxygen dissociation from hemoglobin, and this is known as alkalosis. Carbon dioxide. So we know that carbon dioxide is a waste product that accumulates from cellular respiration, and we get rid of it via exhalation. There are 3 methods of transporting carbon dioxide. 10% of it is carried by red blood cells, and 85% of it is dissolved in plasma as carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is synthesized in the red blood cells, where carbon dioxide diffuses from tissues into plasma, and carbon dioxide binds to red blood cells and undergoes the chemical reaction that I have listed here. This is aided by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic acid is not stable and it needs to be broken down further. So carbonic acid can be broken back down to carbon dioxide and water, or it can break down into a molecule of bicarbonate and 1 hydrogen ion. So if you have severe levels of carbon dioxide, because the blood has its own buffering system to ensure appropriate concentration of hydrogen in the blood, we could get hypercapnia, which is increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the blood, and the carbonic acid equation will run forward, but because of the increased hydrogen concentration, it results in respiratory acidosis, which is blood is too acidic, and the respiratory control center will respond by increasing how fast and deep you are breathing. And so it allows for carbon dioxide to diffuse from the body more rapidly and regulates the levels of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. You can also get hypocapnia, which is decreased levels of carbon dioxide, and the carbonic acid runs in reverse, in which the concentration of hydrogen decreases because because the blood is less acidic than it needs to be. It results in respiratory alkalosis, in which the respiratory rate is decreased to regulate levels in the body.